Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. I hope you are having a wonderful Tuesday. I hope you had a wonderful weekend. My weekend was busy, good, uneventful. I think you're caught up now. Anyway, let's not talk about that. Let's talk about books. Let's talk about a book in particular. That book is Upended. I am speaking today with its author. That author is Amanda Kabak, and the description of the book is as follows. Maddie has everything the way she likes it. Her startup, Mindful Management, is the work of her heart, and her business partner, Joe, the ideal complement to her talents. Of course, she'd like to see her younger brother move past his barista stage and get serious, but brotherly obligation means she can work on him during their weekly diner dates. She doesn't like to think about her ex, the perfect Jane, but even if their breakup was painful, it was grown up. The boxes are getting checked. Things are humming. But then everything is turned upside down when Maddie survives a vicious attack by an unknown predator. The moment she opens her eyes in the hospital, it's as if her life starts up all over again on a brand new day one. Except this new timeline reveals that nothing in her old life was what it seemed. Everything Maddie thought she needed isn't turning out how she planned, and honestly wasn't how she really liked it after all. Again, that is the description of Upended, the novel that I am speaking with Amanda Kabak about today. It is a novel about relationships. It's a novel about figuring out if you're on the right path in life. It's a novel about how life changes after something monumental happens, how people can sometimes change when there's something major that happens in their life that causes them to start seeing things in a new light, seeing job and relationships and career path and just kind of everything in a new light. And that is what happens to Maddie. She is the victim of a violent attack, and like the back of the book says, she kind of has this new day one when she wakes up from that attack, when she wakes up in the hospital. She starts re-examining a lot of the things in her life and looking at her relationships differently, her priorities differently, and we follow her on that journey, but we also follow those around her and how her new life and her re-examination of where her life is heading also affects those around her. And it's not just that Maddie is looking at things differently, but this event that happens is almost is a catalyst for other people to start kind of examining their own lives, and they see Maddie going through what she's going through, and partially because of that, but also partially in response to that, there's a lot of different layers for why everyone in this book then starts to think about things differently, look at things differently, and kind of re-examine where they are headed in their lives, what choices they want to maybe rethink or start moving in a different direction, etc. So there's a lot of different pieces, a lot of growth, a lot of relationship evolvement. Is evolvement a word? You know what I mean. And so yeah, that is Upended. I really like Amanda's writing style. It's really smart, and it's really in depth and yet still approachable and easy to read. It's very easy to relate to the characters that she writes, and and move through this book and this journey with those characters. So let's go ahead now and turn to the interview. Again, the book is called Upended. The author is Amanda Kabak.
Hi, Amanda. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
I am happy to have you here to talk about your novel, Upended. Before we get to the book, though, if you would please share a little bit about yourself.
Oh, sure. Well, my name's Amanda Kabak. I'm the author of Upended, as well as the previous novel, The Mathematics of Change. I also have a bunch of short stories out there. You can find a link to a lot of my other writing and interviews at my website, amandakabak.com. I've been a writer for quite a while, although my formative education was much more geared toward the sciences, and I spend my day as a software engineer and technical leader.
All right, thank you for that. So as I said, the book is called Upended. Can you give an overview of that story?
Yeah, definitely. I came to Upended with the idea of, it sounds funny, but what happens when something happens? That's how I think of Upended. So something happens very early in the story. It's not a secret. It's a violent assault of one of my main characters. And the book is really about how that assault not only affects her as a direct victim, but also the people who are closest to her, and really tries to examine its ripple effects among family, friends, and colleagues.
Yeah, and so would you say that was your initial inspiration of what happens when something happens, or was there something else that initiated you wanting to write this story?
No, that was it. I had so what you certainly don't know by reading the book is it's not at all the book I had originally intended to write, and it's not even the book I originally wrote. It started out in a completely different structure, and that structure was really what kind of cradled the original idea of what happens when something happens. I had this idea of, I had a character, I didn't know who she was, something happened to her, which I didn't know what it was. It caused a large change in her, and the entire book was actually written in everyone else's perspective about how they perceived this change and how that change affected them. And so that was kind of it was a very kind of esoteric, structure related kind of thought experiment of, how would a book like that go? And I think the short answer is the very first draft, it didn't go very well. So I had to reevaluate, but it was definitely a pretty theoretical core that got me started on this book in the first place.
I was reading the acknowledgments at the end, and you walk through a little bit of that process. It sounds like this book has gone through quite a few iterations.
Yeah. I do say it was quite painful, but it turned out all right.
Yeah. I can only imagine how exhausted and relieved you must have felt when you finished it.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's talk a little bit about Maddie. She is the central figure of the story. What about her do you think might resonate with readers?
Well, I think, what I address a lot in my writing, whether it's in, this novel, the previous novel, or my stories, is how people kind of cope with their past, and what ultimately drives them to change or not change. And this is where I see, Maddie's experience as somewhat universal. Obviously, hopefully most of us have not been violently attacked, but that's the catalyst that provokes her to dig through her choices and her formative experiences, and grapple with who she's become today, how far that person is from who she wanted to be, or even who she thought she was, and what she wants to do about it. And I think that those are really universal concerns for people of how did I get here? Where am I going now? Am I really who I think I am? Am I who other people think I am? And how do I deal with these expectations, both ones that, I put on myself and ones that I have perceived other people have put on me?
Yeah, I think Maddie is a very strong-willed character, but you definitely start to see her through the eyes, especially of her business partner and her brother. Can you talk a little bit about writing from those different points of views? I know that you I know you started with everybody's view but Maddie, but how did you decide who else to include, how to explore some of those relationships, et cetera?
The brother had always been in my mind. I wanted someone who was close to her, but also wouldn't know everything. And I think family is great for that, right? They know so much about certain aspects of your life and certainly certain time periods of your life. And then you can be a complete mystery to them in other ways. And I loved that about her brother Ethan's point of view, where, that he's significantly younger. He kind of grew up idolizing her. He spent a lot of time with her during a certain period of her life. And then she kind of went off and did her own thing. And so, he was stuck with her, this image of her he had gotten in his mind, when he was really young. And so kind of reconciling who she becomes through the course of the book with that image of her he had, causes him to reflect on his own experience, not only of her, but of his family experience without her around since she was so much older. And so I thought, from a family perspective, that kind of knowing and not knowing was a great dichotomy. And the similar thing is true of her business partner, Joe. I mean, they spend hours and hours and hours together in their startup, and they know each other inside out from like a daily routine perspective and from a like business ideation perspective. But their personal lives are there. You can't work with someone that long and not know a fair amount about their personal life. It just doesn't work that way. But there's always this layer of unknowing there as well, but in a different way from her brother.
It's time to take the first break of the podcast, but as Amanda was talking about the relationship between Maddie and her brother Ethan, I couldn't help but thinking about the relationship between me and I have an older brother and an older sister, but my sister in this case is about the same span of years older than I am as Maddie and Ethan, and it was interesting to watch that relationship develop as we both got older and as we had to learn to react and or respond to each other as adults. And it's interesting as a younger sibling to kind of learn that your older sibling is an adult, is fallible, and maybe not the person that you maybe not hero worshipped, but had a specific image in mind as you grew up. Because in my case, my sister was 6.5 years older than I, and I had a definite view of her growing up, and we're still kind of working through some of those same issues of older sister, younger sister. So that plays out a little bit with Ethan and Maddie's relationship as they start to learn to deal with each other on a more adult level, on less of an older sister, younger brother level. Of course, that's always going to be there. But anyway, it's time for that first break. When we come back, Amanda and I will be talking more about relationships and how they evolve through the novel Upended. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking with author Amanda Kabak about her new novel, Upended. Let's return to that interview.
And then those relationships do eventually start to, as all relationships do, evolve as the story goes on. The attack is really the catalyst for those relationships to start changing a little bit. Can you talk about that evolution as the book goes on?
Yeah, definitely. I think what happens is, the main thing is that Madeline becomes to them kind of unrecognizable, right? Because she's traumatized and she deals with her trauma in a way that they wouldn't have expected. Not that they sat around and wondered how Madeline would deal with trauma. But it really unmoors them, and it also kind of like, if you think about, as I said, I come from science. If you think about like electrical charge, right? Madeline becomes very charged by this experience, and instead of it wanting to draw them closer into her, she actually tries to push everyone away. And so they're kind of cast away from her orbit, which has been really strong up to the attack. And without her as this like gravitational pull, giving them purpose, giving them this kind of solid support, they have to figure out some things for themselves. What they're thinking about this whole thing, where they want to go, how they're going to try to interact with her, and what their company and what their family look like with her in this altered state.
There's also a newly forming, potentially romantic relationship, but you have a scene in the book that is, it's not funny, but it is funny. It's like the worst first date that's not actually a date on the planet. With the food delivery. Oh, I was just, you wrote that so well. It was so awkward and squirmy, and I don't really have a question about that. I just wanted to acknowledge the well-writtenness of that scene.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. That's definitely one of my favorite. It's really uncomfortable.
Yes, it is. I wanted everybody to leave. I'm an internal processor, an introvert. I was like, everybody just walk away.
Yeah, just pretend this didn't happen. Just go. Just leave.
Exactly. Did you do any particular types of research for the book?
It's a good question. I kind of researched around the edges of a lot of different things. One of the good things about writing as you're getting older is you just start to accumulate a bunch of different life experiences that you can pull from, not necessarily like personal emotional experiences, but hey, I've been to a lot of museums, and my partner knows a lot about art, and so I could have some understanding of Zoe's experience as a painter, and know maybe who her influences might be, but that's something I needed to dig into more. What are some techniques that she might use? Where might she find studio space? What tools might she use? Management consulting, which is what Joe and Madeline do, is kind of it's a vast topic. But like I said, I've been in technical leadership. I've been on the other end of receiving management consulting, and knew kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly from the customer side. But obviously doing research about state of the art and what people are trying to sell these days. So and it's kind of and then, a large part of the research was really around what types of injuries Madeline would sustain, how, physically, how would she recover from them, how long would it take, and then emotionally, reading some memoirs and research about, recovering from traumatic experiences, specifically violent assaults, and trying to weave some of that in, acknowledging the specifics of Madeline's experience in her past, and trying to make it, idiosyncratic to Madeline, while acknowledging what a majority of people who are trying to recover from trauma go through.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then how about character development? Obviously, this book went through quite a few changes, but when you started thinking about the characters and as you wrote them, do you like to have a really good picture of them before you start writing? Do you prefer to let the characters evolve as you write? How does that work for you?
Well, I would say I'm about the world's most inefficient writer, and this book did not disappoint on that front. Besides starting with a completely different structure and different points of view, a lot of the way that I write is through exploration. And so it is writing a lot of words that ultimately don't end up in the book, but try to get me to a place where I might understand what's going on. And that's specifically around the characters. What's their voice? What's their experience been? How do they hold themselves? How do they walk and talk? But what's interesting about this book, in a really kind of frustrating and dismaying way, while I was inside the process of it, is I think I was about 3 years into writing it when I had it workshopped at a conference up in Vermont, and the workshop leader was pretty positive about it. But she asked me one question. She's like, "What does Madeline wear?" And you're 3 years into something and you actually don't know what your character wears to work, which seems like a fairly innocuous thing. But it sent me down this rabbit hole of, first, the realization that I didn't know Madeline at all. Like, wow, I had no idea what her past really entailed, like the specifics of it, and what were her motivations and fears, just by the simple question of, what does she wear to work? And so, it took an enormous amount of time and effort to get to that point of knowing what I didn't know. And then it was, all right, well, let's just put the brakes on this, right? Because I can't actually make this book work. I can't have it have integrity as a piece of art if I don't know this fundamental thing about the fundamental character in the book. And so it probably took me, several weeks or up to a couple of months of just writing about Madeline, not within the setting of the story, but outside of it, to figure out, well, what does it mean that she grew up in the Arizona desert? What does this mean that she had a difficult relationship with her father? What does it mean really to have this younger brother? What happened to her in high school? What happened to her when she came out when she was 14? And really getting into the specifics of that, and how Madeline, as a self-consistent character, as consistent as any of us can be as human beings, would have internalized and reacted to those experiences. How Madeline would, not how I would, but how Madeline would, and how that would be different from how, at least how I hope I would have responded to living Madeline's formative years.
It sounds like that was a really great question that led to some positive changes in the book, but I can imagine it was also a question that kind of made you want to beat your head against a wall.
Oh yeah, I almost when I got back from the conference, I do a lot of my, or at least before COVID, I did a lot of my writing in coffee shops, and I remember specifically in what coffee shop I was sitting, where I was sitting in it, what I was looking at outside the window, when her question really, really, really hit me. And I realized I didn't know what I was doing, and I was 3 years into this thing, and I just about cried.
I don't blame you. I don't blame you. It would have been very easy to just chuck it and move on to something else. But
Yeah.
I'm impressed that you persevered. That's wonderful.
Let's go ahead and take our second break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking about autobiographical elements within Amanda's writing. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Amanda Kabak. Let's go ahead and return to that interview.
You mentioned that, as you get older, you collect life experiences. Are there particular autobiographical elements within your writing?
I mean, everything comes from, your head, so you can't escape it. I try not to really let much of my personality get into my characters, but yeah, I mean, definitely bits and pieces. Joe and Madeline run a startup. I have worked in several startups in my career. Actually, if you sign up for my newsletter, you'll get a little tongue-in-cheek satire I wrote about how to survive working in a startup. So there's a lot of that kind of work environment that I understand and the pressures involved in it. But not at all what they do specifically in that. Zoe and Ethan are both artists in some respect, not at all the respect that I try to be as a writer, but there are, certain kind of universal experiences that you have making art and trying to share that art and being successful with it, whatever success really means when you're talking about art. So yeah, I mean, different pieces of experience in my life come out in my character circumstances or tangential to them. But I think the most important thing for me is to try to make them have their own integrity, have experiences and reactions that are very different to my own, and to want things potentially that are different from what I want. Because my experiences, even though I've been around a while and I've done a bunch of different things, I still consider it pretty narrow. And writing about people who are different from me is and talking to people who are different from me to help inform that are one of the kind of great pleasures of being a writer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. Are you working on anything new right now?
Yeah, what's funny about writing and publishing is the publishing timeline is really slow, especially when you're a writer like I am, who I'm somewhat established, but I don't have this great conveyor belt going of having either pre-sold novels or people kind of waiting for the next one to come out. What happens is I'm usually actually done and trying to sell the next one as the previous one is coming out. So I've had another novel done for actually close to a year now, that I've been trying to sell, even while Upended was getting final edits and being released. And I'm actually in the midst of working on the one after that, which I've completed a draft of, and it's kind of sitting and, as I say, congealing, or trying to congeal and turn into something, while I don't look at it for a while. But it's a kind of a constant cycle of creation, and then that happens in parallel to, and it's is barely related to the publishing side of the writing world, which is a business, so it's very different.
I can only imagine that has to be at points confusing, because you're promoting a book that you wrote a couple of years ago, or however long that process has taken. You finished a book that's being edited. You may be working on something else. I would constantly be worried that I would just start talking about the wrong book.
Yeah. I try to remember. Okay, wait. Yes, we're talking about Upended. What was that? And in fact, right as it was coming out, I was like, I actually better read this again, because I had actually, even after you sell a book, it can take 18 months to come out. And so, there's this whole flurry of activity when you sell it and you do these original edits, and then it just goes away somewhere for a while until it gets released. And meanwhile, you're happily working on characters completely unrelated, and you're like, wow, I don't actually remember everything that happens in this book anymore. And right. I'm supposed to know everything about it now.
Right. Well, you did write it, so.
Yeah. Well, what the funny thing is when I'm sure it happens to all writers, but when I go back and read something, I'm like, wow, I don't even really remember writing that part, or how did I come up with that sentence or that metaphor? It's lost to time. But it's really funny to come back to your work as almost I wouldn't say complete stranger, but certainly someone who is somewhat unfamiliar now with the details.
Yeah, I've had that experience a little bit. When you read something that you wrote however long ago, and I think, oh, well, that's actually not bad.
Yeah, exactly.
You're writing it, but hey.
That's it. That's actually what happened with this book. Is it took so long, and it was so demoralizing for so much of it, that I was like, I actually don't know if it's good anymore, and everyone's like, oh, no, I really like it. And I go back and I read it. I'm like, well, okay, I guess it's okay. I guess it turned out all right.
What do you think keeps you going when you get to those points that, as you said, are demoralizing, or when you're stuck and you just don't feel like you know where the story's going? What keeps you writing?
I had a friend that was, she studied opera singing. And I'm trying to remember when we had this conversation. It was, of course, 25 years ago or something, because it was around college. And she was saying, the people who are doing this are people who can't not do it. Meaning they don't have a choice. They feel so compelled that they will, they'll go through all of this training. They'll go through the incredible competition of auditioning for roles, and they'll do this over and over and over again, and to potentially the detriment of other things in their life, or any sort of financial security, because they can't not. And she said, I can't not do this, which means I'm not going to do it, because it's kind of so hard that it's not, I'm not going to persevere in it. And I'd say it's something similar to that for me with writing. It's something that I always wanted to do for a long time in my life. I wasn't very serious about it. I would go through these spurts where I would somewhat quickly draft a not very good novel, and then tinker with it a little while, and then get distracted about something else and put it down. And then about, a dozen years ago or so, a whole bunch of different circumstances kind of happened at the same time, and I made a deal with myself. Basically, I had to take this job that I didn't particularly want to take, But I said, hey, if you take this job, which had actually really regular, reasonable hours, you're going to commit to writing. And so I made that deal with myself, and I started writing every day, and that was it. It suddenly really got its teeth into me, and it became something that I can't not do. I don't feel like myself when I'm not trying to create something. And as painful as it can be to realize, what a failure some of your writing is, or, as hard as it can be to sit down every day and really look at what you're trying to put down, and literally what you're trying to do is figure out what's wrong with it. How is it not as good as it can be? How can I fix something? How can I find the thing that's in it that needs to get fixed? That can be a really kind of ongoing, low-level, painful experience, but at the same time, it's exhilarating, and it's incredibly satisfying to push yourself to do something in a way that other people haven't, or to say something in the most kind of crystallized, true way that you can, and to give life to these stories and these emotions that you've had in your head that you really want to share with other people. And so it's, at this point, it's a compulsion. I can't not do it. I love it as much as I hate it. And even if I hate to say this again, I hate to say this because I don't want to put it out to the universe, but even if I couldn't get my work published, I can't see a way that I would stop trying to produce it at this point.
It's time for our final break of the podcast, but when we come back, Amanda will be sharing her advice for aspiring authors. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and we'll be right back.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Amanda Kabak.
From that experience, then, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
If you could not do it, don't do it. No, but seriously, you got to put the work in, and you've got to love doing the work. So, however, there are people who kind of commit themselves to it in different ways. I was I'm going to write every day kind of person. There are people where that doesn't really work with their lives, and they say, well, I'm going to write when I can, but I'm going to have this physical space where I can go to every day, where the muse is going to find me, where I'm going to write. But I think the key is to learn to love it, to understand that you're going to write some really crappy first drafts, and that's okay. That's part of the process. But learning to love revising, learning to love trying to push yourself to make things better, and writing for the story itself, getting your ego out of the story and saying, hey, this is what I came to the novel wanting it to be, but I'm a year in and 75,000 words in, and that's not actually what I thought it was. It's not turning out how I wanted. And recognizing that what you want doesn't really matter that much. If you're making a piece of art that has its own integrity, And so pulling your ego out of it and saying, well, what does it want to be? What is the grain of this story, and how can I work with it instead of against it? And abandoning yourself to this thing that you're creating that is coming to its own fruition, with its own heartbeat and its own consciousness, and tending to that instead of tending to your own wants for it, I think is ultimately a key to your writing having some power and influence.
Thank you for that. When you take the time to read for yourself, what authors and genres do you tend to turn toward?
Well, since I write a lot of literary fiction, I read a lot of literary fiction. I read a lot of fiction by women as well. So, one of my favorite books of all time is Mary Lawson's Crow Lake. She's a Canadian writer. It was her first book, and it's incredible. Another Canadian writer is Miriam Taves, who wrote Women Talking. She's coming out with a new book as well. I used to read a lot of Barbara Kingsolver. I'm actually rereading Prodigal Summer now for another book I'm thinking about writing. And then the Poisonwood Bible was amazing. Amy Bloom's early short stories just blow me away. They're so every time I try to make up my writing list, I try to read a couple dozen books a year. I'm a fairly slow reader and also work full time, so I gotta kind of shoehorn it in. I feel like those 24 books are so paltry compared to everything that's coming out and all of the books that came out that I haven't read yet. And so you're just always trying to keep up, which is a complete losing battle. But at least it's a pleasure to try.
Yeah, I completely hear you on trying to keep up. And it actually reminded me of an aspect of Madeline's character that I enjoyed, was her book hoarding. It's really not important to the story, but there's a point where she gives away a number of books and she only keeps 200.
Yes. Yeah, I have moved a lot in my life, which is the only reason why I have a reasonable book collection. Because otherwise, yes, it would be. And it is, we still, even with my quote, reasonable book collection, we stopped trying to get people to help us move years and years ago because there were way too many boxes of books.
Yes, I completely understand. I try to go through every time I move. I haven't lived anywhere longer than 3 years since college, and so every time I move, I try to get rid of books, but it's hard.
It's hard. Sometimes I want to keep an entire book just for a paragraph that was in it that struck me very strongly. And sometimes it wins out, and I do keep it, and I might keep it through several moves until being like, okay, that's enough. I can get this out of the library. But yeah, it's hard to let go of books, especially if they've touched you. And going back and rereading things. Rereading things is always really interesting to me because there's some where I can reread them almost endlessly and still love them, and then there are some, where the second or usually it's the third rereading, and I'm like, either I've changed a lot or the world has changed a lot, but it's not quite as gripping as I remember it being, or as affecting as I remember it being. And that happens actually, especially the more I read and the more I learn about writing. I'm like, okay, I think I would have edited that, but that's a really ballsy thing to say about a well-regarded published book. That's not mine. I could have edited that.
Right. So I know you have a website. So if you can share the website as well as where people might be able to find you on social media.
Yeah, definitely. So the website is my first and last name. That's Amanda Kabak, KAB as boy, AK.com. And there you'll find links to basically everything you would ever want to read that is available online, as well as whatever you can order. I am on Twitter at Amanda Kabak. and I try to be somewhat entertaining there. I fail and go dark sometimes, which my publicist would hate, but um, there's the Twitterverse is a pretty interesting place, especially for writers. Lots of witty stuff going on in the Twitterverse. So you'll find me there, and I do actually have, strangely enough, given all the literary fiction I write, I have a romance novel coming out in May. From Bella Books called Training for Love. So I will be talking a lot more about that on my website, in my newsletter, and on Twitter, and giving some excerpts about that as well.
This is a little bit random, but can I ask you about the profile picture that you have for your social media?
Oh yeah, is that the Scout Finch one?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's my alter ego is Scout Finch from To Kill a Mockingbird. So the picture I use is her looking pretty disdainfully while sitting at the dinner table, I think probably holding a fork of mashed potatoes or potentially grits, given where the story takes place. But yeah, Scout has always kind of been this. I was a little bit of a weird kid. I always identified way more with fictional characters than real people. And so I carry, 3 or 4 fictional characters around with me all the time as part of my personal identity. And Scout Finch, and also according to my mother, is, a lot like who at least I was, and kind of who I want to be. This fearful yet fearless bundle of questions. Who's just trying to figure things out and figure out where she sits in the world, where her family sits in the world, and tries to make sense of what's happening around her, which can be very scary and nonsensical.
Yeah, the expression on her face in that picture just says a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had to ask.
Yeah, well, it's my avatar at work too, wherever I've worked, and so it always sparks a conversation. But I feel like that's definitely a core part of my personality. This kind of what is happening here.
Yeah. Amanda, we've talked about a lot of different things today, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you were hoping to highlight during our time together?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think, I could talk about writing endlessly. Most people don't want to hear about it, just like anyone's passions. They get a little too deep. But, reading, I guess I'll just put a pitch in for reading itself. I mean, obviously I'm preaching to the choir here, but in our world today, reading is absolutely critical, and fiction is a wonderful way to do it. I did some volunteer work for a high school on Chicago's West Side. Everyone hears about Chicago's South Side and the problems there, but the West Side has many similar issues. The high school that I volunteered at, I believe the stat was that at any time about 10% of their student body was homeless. And what we did as a community, we would come in there and mentor them through a senior project, which was a big research and thesis driven paper and presentation. And what we were doing was partly, preparing them to do this kind of thing in college, but it was also partly to bring the rest of the city into their school and into their neighborhood and show them different ways of living from what they were steeped in. And books are about the cheapest, most effective way to do that at a broad scale that we have at our disposal. There are ways, especially fiction, to crack open someone else's experience and let you inside it and engage your empathy. And doing that repeatedly with books and seeking out books that represent experiences different from your own are some of the best ways to be a good citizen of the world and to try to open yourself up to understanding disparate experiences and empathizing with them, and seeing what exists outside of your bubble. And we all have bubbles, and bubbles are very hard to escape, especially in today's environment of social media. So read widely, read often, read fiction, and if you're reading fiction by an author like me or another lesser known author, given our environment of clicks and stars and reviews, click and star and review. Let people know what you think. It'll help them broaden their experiences as well and get exposed to things that they wouldn't necessarily get exposed to.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you as well for taking the time to talk to me about Upended and writing. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on, Sarah.
Thank you so much once again to Amanda for joining me to talk about Upended. When she was talking about libraries toward the end there, I couldn't help but think of, I've been seeing, reading, hearing, etc., a lot of comments from people who wonder what place libraries have in our society anymore, and they're so important. I mean, as you know, if you're a regular listener, libraries are near and dear to my heart. My father is a retired librarian, but I was watching a video maybe on TikTok recently, and they were saying how libraries are one of the few places left in our society where people can go and just be. Nothing is expected of them. They don't have to buy something. They don't have to produce something. You can go to a library and use the computer. You can go to the library and read. You can go to the library and get out of the weather, and nothing is expected of you, as opposed to a coffee shop where you can go and sit, but you have to buy something, etc. And libraries are so important, not only for that, but because they provide services to people who may not have access to those services elsewhere. It's not just about books. It's about access to internet and access to computers and access to information and so many more things. So if you're not already doing so, please support your local library. And it's a great place to check out books from your favorite authors or find new authors. So yeah, if you don't already have a library card, why the heck not? Anyway, thank you to Amanda for taking the time to talk to me about her writing and Upended. This is such a beautifully written book, and it's just so lovely the way she explores all of the relationships throughout this book. And of course, I don't want to give away anything that happens throughout the book, but just the relationships between her coworker Joe and her brother Ethan. And it's not a romance, but there is this potential, maybe perhaps developing romance between Maddie and Zoe, and watching that grow and evolve, because it does start happening right after and around the time of the attack, and so that gets kind of caught up in that whirlwind and the results of that attack. So great character development, great book to watch the evolution of relationships, and a great examination of, how did Amanda put it, something about the changes that happen after a change. She said it better than that, but toward the beginning she said something along those lines, and this book really does explore those types of changes really well and in a lovely, lovely way. So if you are a fan of literary fiction, you should definitely check out this book, Upended, and maybe Amanda's other writings and her other novel, The Mathematics of Change. I hope that you are having a great week. I hope that you will join me for my next author interview, when I will be speaking with author J.P. McLean about her fantasy novel. It's called Bloodmark, and I'm looking forward to talking with her about that book, and I'm looking forward to sharing that interview with you. So in the meantime, if you're a fan of this podcast, I hope that you will follow on social media, of course, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Would love to hear from you. And also, if you could take a moment to leave a review of this podcast, starred or written, either one is great. Either one gets the podcast out to more people. And I would greatly appreciate it if you could take the time to leave a review. So thank you again for joining me Again, I hope you're having a great week. And as always, I hope that week affords you plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.